Let's begin with this schema. From left to right, it shows the superpositioning of information within psychobiology of core importance for understanding anxiety. Let's summarize it first before exploring each part in detail. The genome encodes and releases instinct, which exerts a drive state on the psychophysiology of the person to push the person, under a teleology, to adapt to the outside world. Then we have meta-instinct, which provides a paleo-human, phylogenetic, or evolutionarily conserved, context for the instinctive pressure. Then the ego, with its four qualia of ego consciousness: cognition, affect, sensation, and somatic representation. The ego acts as an essential interface with the outside world, receiving a representation of the upstream superpositioned information for informing its adaptation for action in the world. The drive state, as depicted here, coloured in green, is calm. The energy of the person in such an illustrated scenario would feel a great amount of energy for life, but, to borrow a phrase from Steve Richards, be calm, relaxed, and confident. If, however, we show an acute state of anxiety, the drive state switches to an immensely high energy, representing an increased level of instinctive pressure, which pulls into any or all of the qualia of ego consciousness. In this case, please note, the meta-instincts are not present. This is our bird's eye view. Now we can explore it in much more detail. First, let's look at the genome. From the moment it forms, an individual's genome anticipates the entire arc of their lifespan. Maturation is always on timed release, moving us from child through adolescence into adulthood, midlife, and old age. Maturation of the kind relating to personal development and adaptation is always mediated by instinct. Thus, as Steve Richards says, quote, "Instinct is the emissary of its master, the genome." With each stage of life we progress into, our instincts are always looking for full adaptive release. The instinct in question is fundamentally Pangsepian instinct. It's named as such after the founder of affective neuroscience, Professor Jaak Panksepp, who discovered the so-called 7 basic emotional systems. These are seeking, fear, panic/grief, rage, care, play, and lust. These are ancient. At the very least, they are shared in common between all mammals, but this is by no means a hard cutoff. It's very likely that they extend to include birds too, and the brainstem and midbrain structures which act as the neurological start point for some of the circuits, such as the ventral tegmental area for the seeking system, dates back all the way to at least the dawn of the vertebrates, some 550 million years ago. This inarguably shows how important they are, but on the flip side, how only relatively important they are, given that our own species only emerged as recently as the Paleolithic. So we should not collapse into these as being the essential level of analysis, description, and explanation with which to understand ourselves, but we still need to understand them nevertheless. In the emerging field of neuropsychoanalysis, the 7 basic emotional systems are seen as synonymous with Freud's drives, arising from the id and exerting pressure on the ego to meet their corresponding needs in the world. Again, in neuropsychoanalysis, the person naturally comes to understand what that need might be based on what affect the drive gives rise to. So, if the person feels a sense of general enthusiasm, it would be said that the seeking system is on and looking to be satiated through some activity in the world. Affect and drive are thus seen as functionally synonymous with each other, specifically whenever the ego is needed to become conscious of the drive to meet its needs in the world. Steve and Pauline Richards' psychosystems analysis, however, differs quite significantly in this. Affect is not synonymous with the drive, but rather affect is a representation of the drive within a paleo-mammalian and paleo-hominid configured qualia of ego consciousness. This is shown in the schema. The drive state is a priori to the affective qualia of ego consciousness, and can just as easily collapse into, for example, cognition rather than affect. This allows for a much greater nuance for understanding not just anxiety, but all psychodynamics. Anxiety is, at core, the drive state, superpositioned with its upstream, instinctive, genomic, and field level, not shown in this particular schema, intentionality, which can collapse via representation into any of the qualia of ego consciousness. To really emphasize this, as it's so very, very important, let's consider so-called free-floating anxiety. The person simply feels anxious at the sensory and somatic levels of representation. There's no associated affect or cognition at all. They just report being anxious. Now, if we consider someone with so-called panic disorder, deep structure is exactly the same, albeit with the representation within ego consciousness possessing a more acute sensory representation with an intense affect of fear. They may have a small flash of cognition, but it's dwarfed by the affective and sensory representations. Then what about someone who is constantly worrying and ruminating? So-called catastrophic thinking. The dominant representative qualia is cognition, with some level of varying affect, but the sensory and somatic qualia, very often, never come to mind. All of these are various so-called types of anxiety, but they all arise from the same place, a drive state, simply collapsing into different representations within the ego. Thus, if someone believed that anxiety was simply a disordered emotion, they would have no framework whatsoever to understand that what is being communicated to them implicitly through the anxiety state has an intentionality which arises from the truly non-ego psyche, and, deeper still, superpositioned with the genome and its associated fields. It is there where it can be resolved. This brings us on to the meta-instincts. We have a recent video on the Jung to Live By channel that's over 4 hours long, covering this topic in enormous detail, but we will do our very best to summarise the core of what's needed to know for this topic today. Meta-instincts are a psychodynamic introduced by Steve and Pauline Richards, sharing a cultural genealogy all the way back to Plato, including Jung's archetype, Freud's archaic heritage, and the sign-stimulus and innate releasing mechanism of Tinbergen, Lorenz, and the ethologists, with the latter first syncretized with Jung by Dr. Anthony Stevens. Meta-instincts are human social instincts, evolutionarily conserved entire scenarios which anticipate the structure of our lifespan. They evolved much later than the Panseppian instincts to provide a human context for them. When meta-instincts are appropriately online, the Panseppian instinctive pressure dials down, as they have an appropriate context with which to be released. Thus, the overall drive state of the person calms down. In other words, the person is adapted properly, both to their environment, their instincts, and their potential. It should be pretty clear to see then that when meta-instincts are not online, most notably due to complexes within the self-concept of the ego, which we'll cover later in this video, the instinctive pressure, from its perspective, is not being adapted to or released appropriately. Thus, its associated drive state surges and fires forward towards the ego. The ego then experiences this as a collapse into one of its qualia of ego consciousness, such as a feeling of fear or cognitive ruminations, or in general, anxiety. Therein is the implicit trap for the modern, more cognitively inclined ego. If it attempts to understand anxiety through its own cognition, or otherwise simply staying within the resolution of the ego, it cannot understand the implicit intent which is being communicated to it through the drive state. For this, the ego will need to get outside of itself, outside of its usual day-to-day interface with its ongoing experience, and receive the deeper meaning implicit behind the drive state.